The first bet slapped down on the trestle table was 3 silver marks against Bagrak Ashwalker's own life oath, and the man who laid it was laughing before the coins even stopped ringing. 3 marks says she breaks it before the moon turns, Grosh Ironjaw bellowed, loud enough that half the harvest fair turned to look. 3 marks says Bagrak Ashwalker does not kneel for any human farmer, no matter how loud she shouts it in front of the whole clan. Bagrak did not answer him with words. She answered him by shouldering through the crowd of traders, tanners, and gawking clankin gathered around the betting table, her braided black hair swinging against a back of solid muscle, her fitted leathers creaking with each long stride. The leather was dark oxblood, boiled and shaped tight to her body, laced up the sides from hip to ribs, studded along the collar with small bronze rivets that caught the low autumn sun. A hunting knife rode her thigh in a sheath worn soft from years of use. She was beautiful the way a drawn bowstring is beautiful, all coiled strength and promise of motion, and every soul at that fair who had ever heard her name knew better than to mistake her calm for softness. She stopped 3 feet from Grosh and set her palm flat on the tally board where the bets were being scratched into the wood with a burnt stick. "Then write it plain," she said, "so there is no crying about it after. I, Bagrak Ashwalker, daughter of Kudrag, claim Daniel Warren before this fair as my own. Any man of my clan who thinks I will not finish what I start is welcome to put his furs where his mouth is." The crowd made a sound like wind through dry grass, 100 whispered names passing back and forth. Somewhere behind the grain wagons a dog barked. Somewhere closer, a man went very still. Daniel Warren had been standing at his own stall not 20 paces off, weighing out sacks of late barley for a woman from Thistledown Crossing, and at the sound of his own name spoken like a declaration of war, he nearly dropped the scale. He was not a large man, not next to Orkin who stood a head and shoulders over most humans, but he was solid in the way that came from years behind a plow and years more, rebuilding a farm that fire and drought had tried twice to take from him. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his forearms scarred faintly white from old rope burns and older grief, and his eyes, when they lifted and found Bagrak striding toward him through the parting crowd, held none of the fear a sensible man might have shown. They held something closer to wonder, and under that, a stubborn, steady warmth that had been there since the first time she had walked up to his cart 3 months back and asked him, bluntly, why a man who farmed alone always sold his best grain first and kept the cracked kernels for himself. Grosh Ironjaw's voice cracked through the murmuring crowd like a whip. 5 marks, then, since she is so certain. 5 marks says the human breaks first, once he understands what he is agreeing to. Coins hit the table. Furs followed, thrown down by other clankin who had gathered close, some grinning, some scowling, all of them certain that whatever was happening here would end in either a wedding or a funeral, and either way it would be worth talking about for winters to come. Bagrak did not look back at them. She walked straight to Daniel's stall, put both hands flat on the wooden counter between the barley sacks, and looked at him with the same directness she used when sizing up an enemy across a battlefield, though there was nothing of the enemy in her eyes now, only heat and certainty, and something that made his chest ache. "Daniel Warren," she said, low enough that only he and the woman buying his grain could hear it clearly, though the whole fair strained to listen. "I am done waiting for you to work up the courage to say what we both already know. Give me your hand." He set down the scale. His heart was going like a rabbit's, but his hand, when he lifted it, did not shake. She took it in both of hers, turned his palm upward, and drew the tip of her hunting knife across the pad of his thumb, quick and shallow, a bright bead of blood welling up. Before he could flinch, she pressed her own thumb against his, mingling the blood between them, and the crowd behind her erupted into noise, half of it cheering, half of it furious. "There," she said, quiet now, just for him. "That is the first mark. There will be more before I am done with you." Daniel looked down at their joined hands, at the blood, at the woman who had just declared in front of her entire clan that she intended to marry him, and felt the strange, dizzy joy of a man who has spent 3 years alone on a half-ruined farm, suddenly finding himself wanted, fiercely and completely, by someone who could have had any warrior in her clan for the asking. "I'm not going to break first," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried further than he meant it to. Grosh Ironjaw laughed out loud at that, but there was an edge under the laughter now, the sound of a man who has just realized his bet might not be as safe as he thought. The fair at Thistledown Crossing sprawled across the river flats every autumn like a small kingdom raised overnight. Wagons and hide tents and canvas stalls stretching from the old stone bridge clear out to the tree line, drawing traders and farmers and clanfolk from 3 days' ride in every direction. It was the one place in the whole border country where humans and orcs mingled without swords drawn, where grain was traded for hides and hides for iron and iron, for whatever coin still had value that season, all under the loose truce that the fair masters enforced with more stubbornness than any king's law. Bagrak had come every year of her adult life. Daniel had come every year he'd had anything worth selling, which for the 2 years after the drought had meant nothing at all. This was the first fair in 3 seasons he'd arrived with a full wagon, and the first fair he'd arrived already half in love with a woman his own kin in Thistledown Crossing would call an enemy on sight. They had met the way most things worth having are met, by accident and then by choice. 3 months back, at the smaller trading post upriver, she had walked past his cart, stopped, backed up, and demanded to know why a man selling grain to feed a hungry border town was giving away his best barley at a loss just because a widow with 6 mouths to feed couldn't pay full price. He'd told her it was none of her business. She'd told him that made it more interesting, not less, and bought the whole cart's worth herself at full price, then handed it back to him and told him to give it to the widow anyway, and to stop looking at her like she'd grown a second head, because generous men were rarer than good horses and she intended to keep an eye on this one. She had kept more than an eye on him since. She had ridden 2 days out of her clan's way twice that summer to trade with him directly, had sat on the fence rail of his half-rebuilt barn while he mended it and told her, without meaning to, everything about the fire that had taken his parents and the drought that had nearly taken the rest, and she had listened the way no one in Thistledown Crossing ever had, without pity, only respect. He had not let himself hope for more than that, because hope like that seemed a foolish thing for a man like him to carry. Then she had shown up at this fair and claimed him in front of 100 witnesses, and hope had stopped being a choice at all. That evening, once the barley was sold, and the tally board was crowded with fresh chalk marks recording who had bet what against her, Bagrak found him again at the edge of the firelight where the traders' wagons gave way to the open flats. She had washed the blood from her thumb but not from her memory of it, and she came to him the way a hunter comes to something she has already decided is hers, unhurried, certain, her eyes finding his face and staying there. "You are going to ask me why," she said before he could speak. "Every human I have ever known asks why, as if love needed a ledger." "I was not going to ask why," Daniel said. "I was going to ask what happens now because I have never been claimed by anyone before, or customs or otherwise, and I would rather not embarrass myself getting it wrong." That surprised a short laugh out of her, rough and real. "What happens now is that my clan will spend the next 10 days trying to prove I have lost my mind, and my father will try to talk me back into a marriage. He has already promised to a human lord's son to end a war neither of us started, and half the fair will bet against us out of spite or boredom. And you," she stepped closer, close enough that he had to tip his head back to keep looking at her, close enough that he could smell wood smoke and leather and something warmer underneath. "You are going to have to decide every single day of it whether you want this enough to stand and be looked at." "I have been looked at plenty in my life," Daniel said, mostly with pity. "I think I can manage being looked at with envy instead." She kissed him then, without asking permission, without softness, her hand fisting in the front of his shirt and pulling him up onto his toes, and he met it with everything he had, 3 years of loneliness burning off him like frost off a field at first light. When she finally let him go, he was breathless and grinning like a fool, and she looked entirely too satisfied with herself. "You did not break," she said. "Not planning to," he answered, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything. The marriage her father had promised belonged to a different war entirely, older and colder than any bet laid at a trading table. For 6 years, the Ashwalker clan and the border keep at Voss Hollow had traded raids and grudges across the same stretch of river, cattle stolen, watchtowers burned, young men on both sides buried before their time, until Chief Bagrak Ashwalker and Lord Aldous Voss had finally sat down 2 winters past and agreed that the only peace worth the name was one sealed in blood that did not have to be spilled to matter: a marriage. His daughter to the Lord's son, Edmund Voss, bonding both houses so tightly that breaking the peace would mean breaking family. Bagrak had agreed to it once. In the cold, practical way a warrior agrees to any necessary thing. She had never once agreed to like it, and she had never, until she met a stubborn farmer with sad eyes and a barn falling down around his ears, found a reason to refuse it outright. Her father found her at the fair on the second morning, standing beside her horse at the edge of the clan's hide tents, and he did not raise his voice because Bagrak Ashwalker never needed to. "You have made this very public," he said. "A private foolishness I could have overlooked. A public one with betting slates and my own clansmen taking wagers against your word is a different matter entirely." "I did not ask them to bet," Bagrak said. "You did not stop them either." Bagrak's tusks caught the light as he spoke, his voice heavy with the weariness of a man who had buried too many friends to that river war to see it undone by his own blood. "Edmund Voss is waiting at his father's camp on the far side of the bridge for word that you will honor the arrangement. If you humiliate him publicly, the peace dies with the insult, and every man who has lost a son to that river remembers it was your refusal that started the killing again. Then let Edmund Voss find another bride to buy his father's peace," Bagrak said, though something cold moved through her at the weight of what her father was not quite saying. "I did not start that war, father. I will not spend my whole life paying for it in a bed I did not choose." "You will spend 10 days, Bagrak said, "proving that this farmer of yours is worth what it will cost all of us if you keep him. If, by the last night of this fair, you have not shown all of them, that this is more than defiance dressed up as love, you will stand before Lord Voss and finish what was promised. That is not cruelty, daughter. That is the only mercy I have left to give you." He left her standing there with the wind pulling at her braids and the betting slate somewhere behind her growing longer with every hour, and for the first time since she had drawn Daniel Warren's blood against her own thumb, Bagrak Ashwalker felt something that was almost fear. She did not show that fear to Daniel. Instead, on the 3rd day of the fair, she showed him her clan's oldest game. "A hunt," she told him that morning, finding him at his stall with flour on his hands from bartering a sack of it for rope. "Not for blood, for claiming. If a warrior wishes to test whether her chosen mate has the heart to hold her, she runs and he follows, and if he catches her before the sun clears the tree line, she is proven right to want him. And if I do not catch you, then you will have given my clan a very good reason to laugh at you for the rest of the fair," Bagrak said, "which is a risk you are welcome to decline." Daniel wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at her, this woman who could break a man's arm without much effort and who had, 3 days ago, kissed him like he was the only solid ground in a flooding river. "I have spent 3 years chasing a farm that kept trying to die on me," he said. "I think I can chase one woman across a field." She was gone before he finished the sentence, a blur of oxblood leather cutting through the crowded fair lanes, vaulting a fence rail with the ease of a woman half her size, and Daniel swore and ran after her, boots pounding the packed dirt, past the livestock pens where startled goats scattered, past a cluster of children who screamed with delighted laughter at the sight of a human chasing an orc woman through the middle of the harvest fair, past traders who stopped mid-haggle to watch, and inevitably to bet. She was fast, faster than anything he had a right to keep pace with. But she was not running to lose him, not truly, and she knew every fold of that fairground the way he knew the furrows of his own fields. She led him wide around the cider presses, through a gap between two hay wagons narrow enough that he had to turn sideways, out along the riverbank where the morning mist still clung low over the water. And there, at last, with the sun barely clearing the black line of the tree ridge across the river, she let him close the gap. He caught her arm at the water's edge, both of them breathing hard, and she turned into his grip instead of away from it, laughing, actually laughing, a sound he had not heard from her before, bright and unguarded. "You are slower than a wounded elk," she told him, "and you caught me anyway. That will have to do." "I will take being called slow," Daniel said, "if it comes with you laughing like that." Behind them, back among the wagons, word was already spreading that the human had caught her before the sunrise deadline, and coins were changing hands, and Grosh Ironjaw was cursing loudly enough to be heard clear across the fair ground. That night they sat together at the low fire outside his wagon, away from the noise of the main fair, and she told him things she had never told a human before. How her mother had died in the second year of the River War, how she had learned to fight before she had learned to braid her own hair properly, how she had watched Edmund Voss once, years back, laugh while his men burned an Orc grain store during a supposed truce, and had never once believed he deserved the peace his father was buying with her. "I do not care about his father's keep or his fine coats," she said, staring into the flames. "I care that when I looked at him, I saw a man who has never once had to fight for anything he wanted. And when I look at you, Daniel Warren, I see a man who has fought for everything and lost most of it, and still gets up in the morning to try again. That is worth more to me than every acre of peaceful border land my father thinks he can buy." Daniel reached over and took her hand, the same hand that had cut his thumb 4 days before, and pressed his lips to the small scar already healing there. "I did not think anyone would ever choose me over land and titles," he admitted. "I have spent a long time thinking I was the sort of man people settle for, not the sort they fight for." "Then you have spent a long time being wrong," Bagrak said, and pulled him against her. And this time when they kissed there was no crowd to perform for, only the fire and the river and the slow, deliberate unfolding of two people who had stopped being careful with each other. Edmund Voss arrived at the fair on the 6th day with 12 armed riders and a face like a storm cloud, and the first thing he did was find Grosh Ironjaw's betting table and demand to know if the rumors were true. "True enough," Grosh admitted, with the particular relish of a man who enjoys other people's misfortune almost as much as his own winnings. "The Ashwalker girl has claimed a dirt farmer. My clan is split 3 ways on whether she will actually go through with it." Edmund's hand tightened on his sword hilt hard enough to whiten his knuckles. He was a handsome man in the way that came from never having to labor for anything, his coat well cut, his boots unscuffed by honest work, and there was a cruelty in the set of his mouth that no amount of fine tailoring could hide. "My father has promised her hand to me as payment for 6 years of dead men on both sides of that river," he said. "I did not ride 3 days to be made a fool of in front of a bunch of grain merchants." He found Daniel that same afternoon at the edge of the livestock pens, checking a horse's shoe for a trader he'd known for years, and Edmund's men fanned out around him in a loose, deliberate circle before Edmund himself spoke a word. "You are the farmer," Edmund said, as though the word itself was an insult. "Daniel Warren." Daniel straightened slowly, aware of the men at his back, aware that this was the kind of trouble a smart man walked away from and a scared man ran from, and he intended to do neither. "And you would be Lord Voss's son. I would be the man whose marriage you have made into a public jest." Edmund's voice was pleasant, almost reasonable, which made it worse. "Here is what will happen, farmer. You will withdraw your claim, quietly, tonight. You will tell the Ashwalker girl you have thought better of it, and you will take whatever coin I offer you for your trouble, and you will go back to your little farm and never come to this fair again. If you do not, I promise you, The peace my father is buying will not survive it, and every death that follows will sit on your conscience along with hers." "That is a heavy thing to put on one man's shoulders," Daniel said. "For a marriage you clearly do not want any more than she does." Something flickered across Edmund's face, gone as quick as it came. "What I want has nothing to do with it. What matters is that 6 years of dead men get to stop being dead for nothing, and a farmer's pride is a small enough price for that." "It is not my pride that is at stake," Daniel said. "It is her choice, and I will not take it from her just because you find it inconvenient." Edmund's jaw tightened, and he nodded once to the man beside him, and the circle closed in enough that Daniel felt the first shove against his shoulder, rough and testing, the kind of push that comes before something worse. He kept his feet, kept his voice level even as his pulse hammered. "You will find," Edmund said quietly, "that farmers who cross lords rarely finish the season with a farm left standing." The second shove came harder, and Daniel staggered, catching himself against the fence rail, and that was when a voice cut across the pens like a blade unsheathed. "Touch him again," Bagrak said, "and you will learn exactly how many of those 6 years of dead men I am willing to add to." She had not run this time. She had walked, unhurried, terrible in her calm, and the men who had circled Daniel took an instinctive step back at the sight of her, hand already resting on the hilt of her knife, eyes fixed on Edmund with a promise in them that needed no translation. "This is fair ground," Edmund said, though some of the certainty had gone out of his voice. "Truce law protects us both." "Truce law protects trading and talking," Bagrak said, "not lordlings putting their hands on a man 3 times gentler than they will ever be. Ride back to your camp, Edmund Voss, before I decide truce law is worth less to me than it is to you." He went, eventually, his men peeling away with him, though not before he threw one last look at Daniel, cold and promising, that Daniel did not like the shape of it all. Bagrak turned to him the moment they were alone, her hands moving over his shoulders, his chest, checking for injury with a roughness that was its own kind of tenderness. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride," Daniel said, "and that took worse blows plowing rocky ground for 3 summers running. You should have called for me the moment they surrounded you. And have you come running to save me every time trouble finds me?" He caught her hands, held them still against his chest. "Bagrak, I am not going to be a man you have to keep rescuing. Let me stand on my own feet, even when it costs me a bruise or 2. She studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her dark eyes, and then slowly she nodded. "Stubborn," she said, "and foolish and mine," and kissed him hard enough that the bruise on his shoulder was, for a while, entirely forgotten. The clan's tally board, by the 8th day of the fair, had become something of a spectacle in its own right. A length of scraped hide nailed to a post outside the largest of the Ashwalker tents, covered edge to edge in burnt stick chalk marks recording who had wagered what and on which outcome. Some had bet coin, some furs. One enthusiastic young warrior had bet his own good hunting bow that Bagrak would abandon the farmer within the week. Grosh Ironjaw's name appeared more often than any other, always on the side that swore the marriage would never happen, his confidence apparently unshaken by the foot race or the confrontation at the pens. Bagrak Ashwalker watched the tally grow with a face that gave away nothing, though he came to find his daughter that evening with the particular heaviness of a man carrying bad news he did not want to deliver. "Lord Voss has sent word," he said. "His son claims he was assaulted on fair ground by your farmer and by you both. He is demanding satisfaction, or he says he will consider the peace broken and the treaty void." "He is lying," Bagrak said flatly. "His men surrounded Daniel 3 against 1, and I stopped it before it went further, and Edmund Voss knows it." "I do not doubt you," Bagrak said, "but doubt is not the currency that matters here. What matters is that you now have 2 days left before this fair closes, and if the treaty falls apart because of this, it will not just be your happiness that pays for it. It will be every farm and every camp along that river, human and orc both, when the raiding starts again. So what would you have me do, father?" Marry a man I despise to spare people I have never met from a war his own father is already threatening to restart out of spite. I would have you understand, Kudrag said, and for the first time in the conversation something in his voice cracked, that I buried your mother in that war, and I do not know if I can bury anyone else I love in the next one. That is all. I am not your enemy in this, Bagrak, whatever you have decided to believe. I am only afraid, the way any father would be afraid, watching his daughter walk toward a fire she cannot see the size of yet. She had no answer for that, not one that would not have broken something between them further, and so she said nothing at all and watched him walk away into the dark between the tents and felt, for the first time since the claiming, the true weight of what she had started. She found Daniel an hour later at the tree line behind the fairground, sitting on a fallen log with a lantern beside him, having clearly gone looking for a quiet place to think and found instead a place where a woman with a heavy heart might come looking for him. She did not announce herself. She simply sat and let the silence stretch, and eventually he reached over without looking and took her hand, and that was enough to break something loose in her chest. My father says the treaty may fall apart because of us, she said, that the river war might start again. Do you believe that is on us, truly? I believe Edmund Voss is looking for any excuse to make it so, because his pride cannot survive being refused in front of a whole fair. I do not believe that makes it any less dangerous. She looked at him, at the lantern light catching the lines of worry on his ordinary, unremarkable, achingly dear face, and something in her chest twisted painfully. I have spent my whole life certain of what I want the moment I see it. I am not certain of much right now, Daniel Warren, except that I do not want to lose you, and I do not know yet what that will cost the people I love. Then we find out together, he said, whatever it costs. I did not come this far, past every bit of good sense a farmer ought to have, to let you carry that weight alone. She kissed him then, slow this time, aching, and he pulled her down into the fallen leaves beside the lantern. And for a while the treaty and the tally board and Edmund Voss's wounded pride all fell away into something quieter and warmer. Two people choosing each other with no witnesses at all. Only the fire of the fair glowing distant through the trees and the certainty, hard won and no longer questioned, that whatever came next, they would meet it standing together. The last full night of the harvest fair always closed with a bonfire at the center of the flats, tall as a house, ringed by every wagon and tent and trading table for 100 yards, and it was there, with half the border country watching, that the peace between the Ashwalker clan and Voss Hollow finally broke. Edmund Voss came on horseback, which no one did at a fair bonfire, his 12 riders behind him fanned wide in a way that made the crowd instinctively part and murmur and reach for whatever weapons they had on hand. Lord Aldous Voss himself was not among them, and that absence, Bagrak realized with a cold drop in her stomach, meant that whatever his son intended, the old lord had either sanctioned it quietly or lost control of him entirely. Bagrak Ashwalker, Edmund called out, his voice pitched to carry over the crackle of the bonfire and the sudden hush of the crowd. You have made my father's peace into a joke told at every trading post from here to the coast. I gave you the chance to end this quietly. You chose humiliation instead, so be it. He drew his sword. It was a fine blade, well kept, clearly more decoration than tool in a man who had never had to use it for anything more dangerous than a hunting boar. But a sword was a sword, and he leveled it not at Bagrak, who could have disarmed him in 3 moves and both of them knew it, but past her, at Daniel, standing a few feet away with his hands empty and open. If she will not honor the treaty, Edmund said, then let us see how much she is willing to pay for choosing him instead. One of his riders lifted a crossbow. It happened fast, faster than the crowd's gasp could even finish forming, the bolt already loosed, aimed not at Daniel but at Bagrak herself. A coward's shot meant to end the whole quarrel by ending her. And Daniel Warren, who had never in his life held a sword worth the name, who had no training for this, no reason at all to believe his body could stop a crossbow bolt, threw himself sideways into her path anyway, without a single moment's hesitation. Because some decisions a man does not think through, he simply makes with his whole heart before his mind has caught up. The bolt took him high in the shoulder, spinning him half around, and he hit the ground hard at Bagrak's feet with blood already spreading dark across his shirt. And the sound that came out of Bagrak Ashwalker then was not a sound the fair had ever heard from her before, something between a war cry and a scream of grief, raw and enormous, as she dropped to her knees beside him, even as her free hand drew her knife and flung it in the same motion, burying it in the forearm of the man who had loosed the crossbow before he could draw a second bolt. The bonfire clearing erupted. Bagrak Ashwalker was already moving, roaring commands, clan warriors surging forward to ring Edmund's riders before they could do anything further, and human traders and fair masters alike were shouting about truce law and broken oaths. And in the middle of all of it, Bagrak knelt over Daniel Warren with her hands pressed hard against the wound in his shoulder, blood soaking through her fingers, her face inches from his. "Do not," she said, fierce and shaking, "do not you dare leave me now after everything, do you hear me, Daniel Warren, do not dare." "Did not plan on it," he managed, through gritted teeth, though his face had gone pale and his breathing was too fast, too shallow. "Told you. Not going to break first." "You absolute fool," she said, half a sob breaking through the fury in her voice. "You absolute brave, impossible fool." And she gathered him up against her, careless of her own strength, and carried him bodily toward the healer's tent at the edge of the fairground while her father's warriors closed the last gap around Edmund Voss and disarmed his riders one by one, the crossbowman already bound and bleeding from the knife still in his arm. Edmund himself, sword still drawn, found Bagrak Ashwalker's blade at his own throat before he could finish deciding what to do next. "Truce law," Bagrak said, very quietly, "protects fair ground from exactly this. Your father will hear of what his son ordered here tonight, and I promise you, Edmund Voss, the fair masters and every witness among this crowd will make certain the telling does not favor you." The healer's tent smelled of dried herbs and tallow candles, and Daniel drifted in and out of a haze of pain, while a broad-shouldered orc healer named Ura packed the wound with poultice and pressed a hot iron briefly to seal the worst of the bleeding, a process that made him grit his teeth hard enough to crack a molar, but that Bagrak never once let go of his hand through. "He will live," Ura said finally, wiping her hands on her apron, "if the wound does not turn foul in the next few days, and if someone keeps him still, which I doubt very much you will manage, warrior, given the look on your face." Bagrak did not laugh, though the old healer had clearly meant it kindly. She sat on the edge of the cot through the whole of that night, Daniel's hand in both of hers, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest with an intensity that would have frightened anyone who did not understand what he had become to her. Somewhere near dawn he woke enough to find her still there, eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears she was too stubborn to let fall. "You are still here," he murmured. "Where else would I be? Thought you might be out collecting on some bet," he said with the ghost of a smile, "seeing as you have just proven every doubter wrong in the most dramatic manner possible." "I do not care about the bet," she said, though her voice cracked slightly on the words. "I care that you threw yourself in front of a crossbow bolt meant for me, as if your life mattered less than mine, and I need you to understand, Daniel Warren, that it does not. It does not matter less, do you hear me? If I lost you, I would not." She stopped, jaw working, and pressed her forehead to his uninjured shoulder instead of finishing the sentence, and he brought his good arm up slowly to hold her there, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, because nothing else needed saying. The fair masters convened their council at midday, as was custom for any serious breach of truce law, and the clearing around the great oak platform at the center of the fairground, filled with more people than Thistledown Crossing had likely ever seen gathered in one place, humans and orcs shoulder to shoulder, drawn by a story that had already outrun the fair itself and would be told at firesides for winters to come. Lord Aldous Voss himself had ridden in that morning, grey-faced and furious, and stood apart from his son with a coldness that told its own story before a word was spoken. The fair masters, three graying traders whose authority over truce disputes had never once been questioned in living memory, laid out the accounting plainly. Edmund Voss had drawn weapons on fair ground during a season of protected truce, had ordered a bolt loosed at an unarmed woman over a matter of wounded pride, and had, by every law the fair had ever kept, forfeited any claim his family held to the marriage arrangement, the treaty, and quite possibly his father's patience as well. The peace between the river clans and Voss Hollow, the eldest fairmaster declared, was never meant to rest on one forced marriage in the first place, and any peace that fragile was never peace at all, only borrowed time. Let it be recorded that Lord Voss will treat directly with Chief Bagrak Ashwalker on new terms, terms that do not require any daughter of either house to pay for the sins of the fathers with her own life. And let it further be recorded that the man Daniel Warren, farmer, took a wound meant for another with no thought for himself, in full view of this fair, and by every custom this ground has ever honored, that is not the act of a coward or an unworthy match. It is the act of a man any woman, human or orc, would be fortunate to call her own. Lord Voss, to his credit, did not argue the ruling. He looked instead for a long moment at his son, standing bound and stripped of his sword between two fairmaster guards, and something old and tired passed over his face before he turned back to the platform. "Take him home," he said. "We will speak of terms, Bagrak, when this is finished, and I am sorry, more sorry than I can say, for what my blood nearly cost yours." Bagrak inclined his head once, and the matter, as far as the fair's law was concerned, was closed. But there remained the other matter, the one that had started this whole storm 8 days before, and every eye in that crowd turned, as one, toward the tally board still nailed to its post outside the Ashwalker tents, still crowded edge to edge with chalk marks recording every wager laid against Bagrak Ashwalker's word. She walked to it herself in front of the whole assembled fair, Daniel at her side with his arm bound in a sling and his face pale but steady, and she stood before that board and read the names aloud, one by one, in a voice that carried to the very back of the crowd. Grosh Ironjaw. 10 marks silver, 3 good hides and 1 hunting bow, wagered that I would not go through with this. Rena Stonefoot, 6 marks and a copper kettle, same wager. Tulk Bramblehorn, she went on, name after name, until the whole board had been read, and then she turned to face them all, this woman who had bled from her own thumb to claim a farmer, who had carried that farmer bleeding from a crossbow wound across the whole width of a fairground, who had knelt beside him through a night of fear no warrior's training had prepared her for. "You may pay the winnings to me directly," she said, "since I appear to be the one who won." There was a beat of stunned silence, and then, somewhere in the crowd, someone began to laugh, and the laughter spread until half the fair was roaring with it, the pure, absurd, glorious justice of it too good not to enjoy, even among the men who owed the coin. Grosh Ironjaw, red to the tips of his ears, counted out 10 silver marks and 3 hides into her waiting palms with as much dignity as he could manage, muttering something about never doubting an Ashwalker's stubbornness again. And one by one the rest of the losers followed, coin and fur, and one very fine hunting bow piling up at Bagrak's feet, while Daniel watched with an expression somewhere between disbelief and helpless, aching pride. "I feel I ought to point out," he said quietly, once the last of the wagers had been paid, "that this entire fortune exists because your own kin bet against you, and you have just made every single one of them pay you to your face for doubting you." "They should have known better," Bagrak said, entirely unrepentant, "than to bet against something I had already decided was mine." That night the great bonfire burned taller than it had all fair, built up with the last of the season's dry wood in celebration of a treaty renewed on fairer terms and a war narrowly avoided, and the whole fairground gathered around it one final time before the wagons would begin rolling out at dawn toward homes scattered across the border country. Bagrak Ashwalker stood near the fire with a cup of fermented mare's milk in his hand, watching his daughter with an expression that had, sometime in the last day, softened from fear into something closer to reluctant, aching pride. Bagrak found him there, Daniel's good hand held loosely in hers, and for a long moment neither father nor daughter spoke. "I was wrong to ask you to prove yourself to me with a deadline," Bagrak said finally. "I was afraid, and fear makes fools of even chiefs. He bled for you in front of the whole world, Bagrak. I do not think there is a truer proof of a man's heart than that, or custom or human." "No," Bagrak agreed. "There is not." "Then finish it properly," her father said, and there was warmth in his rough voice now, and something that, from a man like Bagrak Ashwalker, was as close to a blessing as words could manage. "Do not make your clan wait through another 10 days of bets and betting boards to see you claim what is already yours." Bagrak turned to look at Daniel, standing beside her in the firelight with his arms still bound but his eyes steady on her face, and something settled in her chest, certain and unshakable and entirely without fear. "Kneel," she told him, "if your shoulder will allow it. If not, I will kneel instead, because the right does not care which of us bends, only that we mean it." "I can manage kneeling," Daniel said, and did carefully, one knee in the trampled grass before her, the firelight throwing long shadows across the watching crowd, every soul at that fair drawn silent and close to see what came next. Bagrak knelt as well, facing him, and drew her knife one final time, and this time she did not cut his hand. She cut a lock of her own dark hair close to the scalp and pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. "This is the oldest right my clan keeps," she said, loud enough for every witness to hear, her voice steady though her eyes were bright with tears she did not bother hiding. "A warrior does not give her hair to just anyone. It is the part of her that grows closest to her thoughts, closest to her heart, and to give it is to say there is nothing left in me I would keep from you, no doubt, no fear, no part of myself held back. Daniel Warren, farmer of a rebuilt homestead, a man who bled for me before he ever thought to save himself, I claim you before my clan, before your people, before every fire that will ever be lit in memory of this night. You are mine, and I am yours, and I will spend every season I have left proving that this was never a foolish bet at all, but the truest thing I have ever done." Daniel's throat was too tight to answer at first, and when he did, his voice was rough with feeling he made no attempt to hide either. "I have spent 3 years thinking I was the sort of man the world had simply forgotten to want," he said. "You looked at me across a cart of barley and decided otherwise, and you have not stopped choosing me since. Not through a foot race, not through threats, not through a crossbow bolt that should have gone through you instead of me. I do not have anything as old or as sacred to give you in return, Bagrak Ashwalker, only this. Everything I have left to build, I will build with you, and everything I have left to lose, I would lose it all again tomorrow if it meant keeping you." She kissed him then, kneeling in the firelight with the whole fair bearing witness, her hands framing his face with a tenderness that startled even those who thought they knew her best, and the crowd around them broke into cheers loud enough to carry across the river. And somewhere near the tally board, now stripped bare of every wager, Grosh Ironjoe raised what remained of his cup and shouted, with something that might almost have been genuine respect, that he supposed he had never in his life lost a bet so gladly. They stayed at the fair through the dawn, long after the bonfire had burned down to embers, and most of the crowd had drifted off to sleep in their wagons, sitting together at the river's edge where he had once caught her in a foot race, her head resting against his good shoulder, his fingers laced through hers. "I still have a farm to rebuild," Daniel said eventually, quiet in the gray morning light. "It is not much. A house with a leaking roof, fields that still owe me 3 good harvests before they are truly whole again, a barn I have been meaning to fix since before I met you." "Then we will fix it," Bagrak said, "together, since I am told that is what claimed mates do. You would leave your clan for a farmer's roof. I am not leaving anything, she said. My clan is 2 days' ride from your fields, not the other side of the world, and my father has already agreed the border will stay open for trade and travel both ways, treaty or no treaty. I will ride between your barn and my father's fires as I please, and you will come with me when the mood takes you, and between the two of us, I do not think either of us will ever be lonely again. Daniel looked out at the river, pale gold now with the first real light of morning, and thought of 3 years spent believing he would live out his whole life as a man people quietly pitied and quietly forgot, and then looked at the woman beside him, fierce and claimed and utterly, unshakably his, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a better word for than simply home. No, he agreed, drawing her hand up to press a kiss against the small, faded scar on her thumb where a knife had first joined their blood 8 days before. I do not think either of us will. The wagons began rolling out from Thistledown Crossing that morning, one by one, traders and farmers and clanfolk scattering back toward homes scattered across the border country, the great fair folding itself away for another year until next autumn's harvest called them all back again. Bagrak Ashwalker rode beside Daniel Warren's wagon rather than with her father's caravan. Her horse matched to his slow oxen pace without complaint, her winnings from the wager packed carefully among his goods, more than enough silver and hide to see his roof properly mended before the first snow. Behind them, the tally board still stood outside the empty Ashwalker campsite, wiped clean now, waiting for next year's fair and next year's foolish bets. But everyone who had watched Bagrak Ashwalker collect her winnings with her own 2 hands, kneel in the firelight to claim a farmer who had bled for her without a moment's hesitation, and ride out from Thistledown Crossing with that same farmer at her side, already knew there would never be a wager laid against the two of them again. They were, by then, past all doubting. They had made certain of it together in front of the whole watching world.